how would you define what a game is? Better yet, a video game. This might be a topic you already have your own answer for, but for this video, I would like to first take a look at a more professional opinion. According to Merriam-Webster, the definition of a game is as follows: a physical or mental competition conducted according to rules with the participants in direct opposition to each other. Makes sense, right? So what about a video game? This can be defined as an electronic game in which players control images on a video screen. This definition seems relatively vague for such a prevalent entertainment and art medium in our culture. However, it does include one very important word, which happens to be, of course, game. With this in mind, we can rewrite the definition of a video game contextualized in the definition for a game in general. That definition reads a little something like this: a physical or a mental competition conducted according to rules with the participants in direct opposition to each other, played on an electronic device in which players control images on a video screen. This combined definition gives us a little more context as to what a video game actually is, and yet I can't help but feel that video games are beginning to outgrow this definition. The funniest thing I find about this definition is that, according to Merriam-Webster, no single-player video games would be defined as a game, as their definition of competition, which is a core element in their definition of a game, specifically states that it consists of two or more parties. Apparently, competition against the self does not exist. Of course, I think we all would agree that competition against the self does, in fact, exist. So we're just going to look past that part. When including the competition of the self, it's no question that the games we play are, in fact, well, games. We could also look at programmed opponents or enemies as that second party that we are competing against. One that in most cases can even be dialed up or down in difficulty to adjust to our skill level in the game. Something akin to picking opponents of similar skill levels as yourself when playing a board game or a card game. But along with the thousands and thousands of games available to play, there are a handful that simply do not fit that definition. Playable experiences that look like games are designed in game engines like games. They're even controlled with a keyboard and a mouse or controller, just as any game would. But they don't have one key component: competition, even against the self. What do we call these games that are not games? What exactly do they offer us? And how do they differ from the typical games we choose to spend time with? Clickolding is a game that was relatively recently released on June 16th, 2024. It was one of the first games released that was funded by Outersloth, the Among Us developers' new indie game fund, and developed by Strange Scaffold, probably best known for their game El Paso Elsewhere, a Max Payne-style third-person shooter that already has a movie on the way. They also recently released a new hit, I Am Your Beast, a fast-paced and frenetic first-person shooter that should be a new home for Neon White fans. But back to Clickolding. From the title alone, it is pretty obvious that Clickolding is going to be quite a weird and disturbing experience, and it certainly is. But that isn't the only oddity when it comes to this game. See, the thing is, Clickolding really isn't a game. You can even look in the Steam reviews and see this sentiment shared between reviewers. It's not a hot take, it's the general consensus. No, it isn't a game at all. It's an experience. Clickolding is exactly what it sounds like, if that makes any sense at all. It's a clicking simulator, one with a strange man watching you the whole time, desperately waiting for the moment you use the clicker in your hand a total of 10,000 times, causing the counter on the clicker to roll back to 0. This climactic experience is fully captured by the numbers in your hand resetting, proof of your hard work being accomplished. It is an odd and disturbing experience, one with the promise of a $14,000 payout for your deeds. The man mentions something about it being enough to cover the operation. We're never told whose operation it's for. Whether it's for us or a loved one like a child is not to be seen, and ultimately fairly unimportant. Throughout the course of the game, the man gives directions on exactly how he wants you to click. Faster, slower, facing him or facing away, looking at a painting or a static-filled TV screen. And while all you might do is click your mouse and occasionally move around the rundown motel room you find yourself in, not what I would typically call riveting gameplay, there is an unquestionable feeling of immersion. Specifically the feeling that you're being used, watched, and manipulated into this situation that you just want to get out of. After about 30 or 40 minutes of clicking, you finally reach your goal. The clicker approaches 10,000, where it will inevitably reset to 0. Finally, the nightmare is about to end. As the mysterious man's fantasy is fulfilled and the counter ticks over, the debaucherous and shameful deed finally meets its end, and the shame of it all will go to the grave with him. The man pulls out a handgun, and after the quite literal climax of this whole uncomfortable and chilling situation, kills himself before he can reflect on his actions. And that's the end. These types of experiences, games that aren't games, take several forms. Some are in a playstyle more like clickolding, something that feels almost more like an interactive movie that consists of multiple small play elements to interact with the world around you. But then there are also others, such as walking simulators. Walking simulators are an interesting style of game. The name implies it all. They consist of mostly walking, with very limited gameplay, if any, outside of that. Walking simulators, if it's no surprise at all, aren't really games by definition, and yet in their simplicity, they tend to find purpose in even the smallest interactions. Suddenly, the simplest form of gameplay, a basic movement mechanic, is used to tell a story all on its own. The Stanley Parable may just be the most well-known walking sim out there. The writing is superb. Not only is it entirely hilarious, but it can also be incredibly thought-provoking, and the voice acting only adds to the whole experience's charm. It very much channels the feel of Valve's Portal and Portal 2, which I guess is no surprise with the original version starting as a mod for Half-Life 2. Of course, if you've ever played the Stanley Parable, you know there's one other very core aspect to this game I have neglected to mention yet. The endings.
End is never the end, 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 is never the end.
The original mod in 2011 included 6 endings, but this vastly grew to 19 total endings with the full release in 2013. This yet again grew more substantial when the Ultra Deluxe Edition was released in 2022, now boasting a total of 42 different endings. It's not unheard of for a game to have multiple paths the player can take. RPGs do it all the time, and choice-based games like Heavy Rain and the Dark Pictures Anthology are fully built around the idea of letting the player make choices throughout the game. These choices might potentially change the fates of characters by the end of the game, or lead to completely different sections that would be inaccessible if the player was to make a different decision. But something about the Stanley Parable is different. You don't just choose a dialogue option or make a decision for the character with a click of a mouse. You actively choose through action alone. It might seem crazy to say that a game like the Stanley Parable uses its gameplay to a better level than something like Assassin's Creed, and yet, that's what it's doing. For reference, a modern Assassin's Creed title tends to be bloated, combat systems are simplistic and repetitive, and the overall effect tends to lead to these games getting boring far before the 50 hours it takes to complete them. Not to mention the assassination feature. The whole point of Assassin's Creed was not even possible half of the time in several games, depending on your stats and the level of your enemy. A whole core gameplay mechanic, in fact, that should be the core gameplay mechanic outside of fluid movement, goes underutilized in an onslaught of half-baked side quests and cookie-cutter enemies. The reason I bring this up is because these are large-scale games in a long-running franchise published by a massive studio, and even that comes with many core gameplay mechanics that tend to never be used to their fullest potential. The majority of gameplay mechanics end up being more fluff than they are a main aspect within the game that helps tell the story. Even choice-based dialogue tends to lead to no different outcome for your character and others. The Stanley Parable, on the other hand, is definitionally not a game, and yet it leverages its limited play to the best of its ability. There are only really two mechanics in the Stanley Parable: walking and interacting with select objects. And with these two mechanics, you, the player, get to experience 42 endings to this one experience. How? By actually doing the actions it takes to get there. You make a decision, you act on it, and you see where it leads. There's no dialogue tree or even a specific mission route. You just walk in the direction you desire to go and interact with the objects and locations you desire to interact with. It is a practice of active decision-making through action. Your direct actions lead you down a specific route, even if that decision is jumping into a large hole. If the Stanley Parable proves anything, it's that you don't need complex game mechanics and flashy graphics to make a compelling game, if we can even call this a game at all. But however we choose to define it, it's a hell of a good experience that utilizes choice-based play among the best. And I think that's something worth remembering. To the Moon, and the subsequent entries into the series, don't exactly look like the typical walking sim. In fact, at first glance, it would be easy to confuse these games as some kind of turn-based RPG instead, due to the games opting for a top-down camera and pixelated art style. And yet, in all actuality, there are no RPG elements in these experiences outside of referencing the main characters as your party within the pause menu. Just like the Stanley Parable, your main mechanics are movement and object interaction, along with just a hint of puzzle solving added into the mix. To the Moon is the exact opposite of the Stanley Parable in its use of storytelling through walking. While Stanley Parable focuses on using the limited play mechanics to enable choice from the player, To the Moon strips choice away entirely, forcing the player to move forward to only one possible goal. This may not seem like anything special on first thought. Of course, it is perfectly normal for single-player games and other experiences to have a scripted, single route. In fact, it's mostly expected. In To the Moon's case, it is the context of the story that makes the lack of its freedom and choice stand out. To the Moon exists in the near future, a world that still looks much like our own in the brief glimpses we get of the outside world and the homes that exist within it. The main fact that makes this world feel minorly futuristic is the main characters' jobs. You play as Eva Rosaline and Neil Watts, two scientists that work on client cases. What are these cases specifically? Well, that consists of entering the client's minds as they are on death's door and changing their memories to give them a memory of a more satisfying life just before they take their last breaths. I told you it's a little futuristic. To the Moon is the story of one client, Johnny, whose dream is to, you guessed it, go to the moon. The problem arises when Eva and Neil jump into Johnny's mind and talk to a construct of himself from his most recent memories. Johnny knows he wants to go to the moon, but he doesn't know why he wants to go there. This is an important issue when it comes to the method of memory manipulation in the game. See, Eva and Neil are not capable of simply uploading any memory into a client's mind. They have to alter a specific memory, a core memory that created the motivation in the first place to aid the brain into creating false memories from this one change. It creates an entirely new life in the client's mind from that point forward, but it also doesn't erase the memories of important relationships, or at least they do their best to keep that from happening. It's an alteration that requires the finest of touches. Every detail about the client is important as to not screw up the entire process. So of course, the idea that Johnny has no clue why he wants what he wants throws a wrench in the works for our playable characters. It forces them to go back in time in Johnny's memories to attempt to piece together this whole mystery before the inevitable takes place. I don't want to talk about specifics from the memories in Johnny's mind. This really is a piece of art that is best experienced firsthand for the majority. But I will mention just how unique of an experience this is. As you walk through Johnny's life as a ghostly spectator, it genuinely feels that you are witnessing a real man's life. The mistakes he made growing up, the struggles of his marriage, and the hardships of understanding his neurodivergent wife, and the deep, menacingly dark traumas of his past. It doesn't exactly feel right to know all this. These intimate details that made this person who they are laid bare, all in a quest to change them? Even though Johnny wanted it, it feels wrong. And yet, all you can do is walk through the memories and take them in, learn the little details that lead to the next memory, and so on and so on. You come to know Johnny more than he ever knew himself, probably even better than you know yourself. Sparing the largest details, Eva and Neil are successful. Johnny does make it to the moon, at least in his mind. Ultimately, your long walk leads to the final frontier. It isn't a bad ending, at least it doesn't feel that way. But the truth of the matter, the fact that his real life was swept away for the memory of a new one, that's still something you're left to grapple with. The morals of it all, that's up for you to decide after the fact. But within the experience, there is only one way out, and that is to the moon. It's intriguing and puzzling to me that we have no real definition for walking sims other than, well, walking sims. And beyond that, who even knows what something like clickolding would categorize as? I've tried my best to formulate a new title that encapsulates all of these unique pieces. The best I can think of is digital experiences. I think we, people that play games, all understand that these playable art pieces are not exactly video games, but explaining that to the outside viewer can get convoluted and messy. And yet, of course, there are inexplicable similarities between these experiences and video games, those of which go beyond the fact that they are built in a game engine and experienced using devices such as a console or a PC. In C.T. Nguyen's Games Agency as Art, sorry for my pronunciation, Nguyen explains his theory about games and how their unique art is all about submersing ourselves, the players, into temporary agencies. It's a fascinating book that you should really read for yourself, but here is the super basic gist. Games, physical or digital, give us as players an opportunity to adopt a temporary agency around the goal of that game. Tetris, for example, allows us to submerge ourselves into an agency that prioritizes fitting things together quickly and efficiently in order to try and beat our high score. That agency can then be tapped into in real life, say to load the car trunk for a road trip. This is not the entirety of the theory, and there is quite more complexity that is discussed within the book, but this is the gist, and what I want to focus on when it comes to these digital experiences. My theory, and remember this is coming from a random guy on YouTube, so don't necessarily take this as fact, is that these digital experiences also allow us to suspend ourselves in new agencies since we are actively playing these experiences. They may not necessarily be games, but they are interacted with on a very similar level. I would argue that if this is true, if interactive art such as Clickolding and To the Moon allow us to submerge ourselves into new agencies, these experiences have the opportunity to tap into the player in unique ways that little other art truly can, allowing us to fully immerse ourselves within them, learning from the agencies we must adopt to fully experience their intricacies. What Remains of Edith Finch is another walking sim. It's an emotional experience that is not quickly forgotten by those that play through the stories found within it. If I had to guess, that isn't just because of good writing. Edith Finch works directly with the idea of submerging the player into new agencies, and I do mean that in the plural sense. Edith does not take place from a single perspective, with the player taking the perspective of 11 different members of the Finch family throughout the approximate 2.5-hour runtime of a playthrough. Through these perspectives, we come to learn more about the fortunes and misfortunes of the Finches, a family that has what can only be described as a poor relationship to death. Ultimately, What Remains of Edith Finch is an experience that lets us relive those final moments of each family member. It is an anthology of untimely deaths. It's also an anthology of agency, and experiences almost impossible to encounter outside of this specific art form. Each perspective explored within Edith is necessary to understanding the Finch family's legacy. They're also just simply moving, a barrage of unfortunate events that seem ripped straight from the Baudelaires. I don't think I'd even be surprised if it was revealed that Count Olaf was behind all the deaths the whole time. It's impossible to exactly rank where these stories land, as any single perspective or event is meaningful in its own right, as well as each story having the potential to be relatable or impactful to the player on different layers. However, if there is one standout moment that I've noticed most players remember first and foremost, it would almost certainly be the perspective of Louis Finch working at a fish cannery. It might seem strange that one of the most memorable moments from Edith is chopping the heads off a fish with an automated guillotine at a fish cannery, and yet, for as boring, unsanitary, and unappealing as that job sounds, it serves as the backdrop to one of the most fascinating scenes I've ever had the chance to play. It starts just as you'd guess. We, as the player, take up the perspective of Louis, monotonously grabbing a fish, holding it under the guillotine until the blade inevitably falls, and tossing the body to a conveyor belt to simply repeat the process all over again ad nauseum. And then something happens. Nearly half of the screen is taken up by Louis's imagination, and suddenly, you as the player are simultaneously controlling both the work of beheading the fish and walking through a top-down maze within Louis's mind. The sudden change is jarring. Controlling the two events at one time initially feels almost impossible. Similar to patting your head and rubbing your stomach, you find yourself switching up movements intended for one hand with the other, letting fish pile up as you guide Louis through the maze, or leading Louis straight into walls while you focus on the pile of fish. However, just as quick as Louis's imagination appeared on screen, in a snap moment, your mind fully embraces its new agency. It must get through this nonsense to reach the goal, and the only way that happens is to submerge into the reality as if it were your own. After reaching the end of the maze, Louis's imagination becomes more vivid, the scene turning into a fully three-dimensional space. As the scene progresses forward, Louis's imagination continues to grow both physically and metaphorically. The imagination takes up more and more space on the screen, slowly snuffing out the reality underneath it all. By this point, it doesn't matter. The flow has been achieved, a new state of consciousness has been reached. Any difficulty with the controls is gone. You are an expert, an artisan, Not even a machine could do the work so reliably. As Lewis continues his imagined walk through his mind kingdom, Fish will occasionally act as a brief obstacle. Lewis, in all his power, chops the head off of those as he does all the others. He is no mere mortal in his mind. This rhythm is kept for several minutes. The imagined scene plays forward, allowing Lewis to have power and peace even in the monotony of the cannery. When Lewis's imagination finally takes full control over his reality, when it allows nothing in its sacred place of contentment, is the very moment where Lewis is to be made king of his whole land. Lewis bows his head to accept his crown. Another fish caught in the net. Before Your Eyes is not the typical digital experience. Less of a walking sim and more of an interactive movie, it shares more similarity with Clickolding in the terms of telling its story through a simple gameplay mechanic. Only in this case, we aren't talking about clicking, but blinking. You've probably used or at least heard expressions such as time moving in the blink of an eye, or a blink and you'll miss it moment. Before Your Eyes takes this quite literally, putting you in a position where every time you blink in real life, the story moves forward in time within the experience. Within Before Your Eyes, you play as the character Benjamin, mostly referred to as Benny, the soul of a human that now finds himself in the afterlife. It all starts underneath the waves, where Benny's soul is soon pulled aboard a ferry. You come face to face with a ferryman, a humanoid wolf-like creature in charge of this small vessel. He explains that he is taking you to the Gatekeeper, a deity that resides in an ominous tower looming in the distant dark. The ferryman will be rewarded if he brings a soul worthy of the Gatekeeper's paradise, and so, as you travel ever closer towards your potential afterlife, you recount your story. But of course, it isn't quite that simple. A soul can't actually communicate the way a living creature can. The simplicity of speaking is no use. Instead, the ferryman places you in a state where your memories are played out like a movie, one that jumps to the next scene every time you blink. And so, the experience is now fully underway. I cannot completely describe just how interesting and unique it is to control an experience through your blinks. While games and their non-game counterparts always have the feeling of experiencing their events through the main character's eyes, this story is ultimately played out through your own. It's a level of immersion that I've never really seen before in any kind of project, even those in virtual reality. It's a mechanic that puts you, the player, both in and out of control at subsequent times, a feeling I've never really felt before in any other games or experiences. Most of the time, I would find myself able to hold on through a scene to its totality, including interacting with other objects in the scene, also through blinks. It isn't that hard in most cases, allowing moments and scenes from Benny's life to be fully explored before actively choosing to blink and move on to the next. However, there were those times where that didn't happen. On a few occasions, it just happened completely instinctively. I simply was watching what was happening before me, blinked, and it was gone as quick as it appeared. Each time this happened was like a punch to the gut. It was a true blink and you'll miss it moment. Conversations were missed, details went unnoticed, a whole memory just gone in a blink. Before Your Eyes may just be one of the best uses of agency within games and game-like experiences that I've encountered. It is truly an unparalleled experience that brought me into a world in a way that very few stories ever have. By the end, I will say right now that I was unapologetically bawling my eyes out, and I was still getting choked up hours after the experience. I will fully admit that when it comes to games, I tend to be an easy crier, but that tends to be more misty eyes and getting a little choked up, rather than full-on, jaw-quivering, tears rolling down my cheeks, actual bawling. Yes, this experience kind of broke me. Before Your Eyes takes you into a world that is all too real. In a world that only seems to move faster and faster with constant competition for our attention, it's a necessary reminder to slow down and be in the moment. That's an agency I believe we all need more practice in. It's all too easy to blink and suddenly find yourself at the end of it all. After the mysterious man kills himself at the end of Clickolding, you are left in the room, sitting on the bed, just where you started. The clicker is still in your hand. The body is still fresh on the floor. There is no way out of the room. There is no option to open the door. All you can do is click, and, well, it feels a little weird to stop clicking after all this time. The only way to describe this situation is morbidly bizarre. The fact is that clickholding as an experience is potentially the most unsettled I've ever felt while playing anything. The mindset and the agency that it throws yourself into is one of true desperation. The only motivation is to click, to get the moment over with once and for all. Get the money and get out. It's a moment that's probably the most used and unsettled I've ever felt while playing a game-like experience, something I wouldn't expect out of a simple clicker. It's a testament to just how immersive of an experience clickholding is, and somehow the most horrifying moment is the end. Not the death of the man, no, but the desire to keep clicking. See, by this point, it is all you know, all that you can even do. You might as well click a little more. After only a handful more clicks, the large painting overhanging the bed begins to turn, lightly beginning to glow. The more you click, the further it turns, until it's finally rotated a full 360 degrees. The painting is gone, and now you're faced with a glowing white portal. Walking through brings you into a white void with another man. The first clickholder, a character that was mentioned from the man that held us in the room throughout the game, the one that inspired his lust. The ending at this point is up to you. You can exit the program, close it down, and move on from the waking nightmare. Or maybe you should stick around. Maybe you should click just a little bit more. The clicker got you through the nightmare. It couldn't hurt to spend a little more time with it. Just a few more clicks. Just a few. Video games are a fascinating part of our culture and our entertainment. Not only are they a relatively new art form, they're also one of the most prevalent, becoming the largest entertainment industry in under a single lifetime. And from that art form has sprung another tangential one. I still don't know exactly what to call these games that aren't games. Whether they're digital experiences, playable art pieces, gamified art, or simply video games. I don't have the answer, and that answer is beyond one silly guy on YouTube. I do hope that we find that answer one day, though, as whatever these experiences truly are, they deserve respect as their own unique art, as do many other genres that are still being defined. Video games have evolved faster than culture has kept up with them. Where 2D side-scrollers and platformers like Metroid and Castlevania once existed, now we know those types of games as Metroidvanias. And even now, within just the past year or so, we've discovered a whole subsect of that genre now being coined Metroidbranias. There is just still so much we have left undefined and undiscovered. Along with this, video games and their new younger siblings have an innate ability to immerse those interacting with them in ways other art forms simply can't. The ability to put one's own agency into new and unique situations is something that can be used in a truly transformable way. This isn't to disparage other art forms, but simply a concept I am constantly intrigued by and desire to continue exploring on this channel. If you've made it this far, I highly encourage you to go find some of these games that aren't games. If you haven't yet, go experience the choice-based world of the Stanley Parable, or the terrifying motel room of Clickolding, or go find something that I didn't mention in this particular video. There's a ton of them out there. Video games and their relatives have so much to offer. I think even more than we realize. I cannot wait to see what more we discover in the years to come. If you enjoy these kinds of video essays, consider subscribing to the channel. I have more of this format planned and on the way. You may also go check out another video or two on the channel. You might enjoy them. Now, get on out there and go boop a snoot.